What's up everyone, Chad Keys here, and today we're going to be teaching you the basics of taking some sports photos using manual settings. Let's get right into it. So the first thing we need to talk about is the camera gear. What I personally recommend for sports photography is a full frame camera body, and then you're gonna want some kind of a telephoto lens preferably. Here we have a 70-200 optically stabilized. And if you can get a lens that is optically stabilized, that is optimum for sports photography. So now we need to discuss your camera settings by looking at the exposure triangle. So that is your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. So for the first thing is your shutter speed. Your shutter speed is how long the sensor of the camera is being exposed to light. So the faster your shutter speed is, the less motion blur you're gonna have and the sharper your image is gonna be. But on the downside, the faster your shutter speed is, the darker your image will be. So sports photography is kind of finding this nice balance between having a fast enough shutter speed to where you can actually capture a nice crisp image, but not one that's too fast that you can't really even see the image. So once you got your shutter speed figured out, you want to go over to your aperture. Aperture is how much light the lens is allowing into the sensor. For sports photography, light is key for everything, because as I said, you want to have that high shutter speed. So you also want to have as high of an aperture as you can. However, with aperture, it's a little confusing because a high aperture is actually a low number. So the lower the number is, the higher the aperture and the more light you're letting into the camera. So for the example, this lens is a 70-200 f4 aperture lens. That means the fastest aperture this lens can shoot is at f4. So for most times, I'm stuck at f4 when I'm shooting sports photography. So that way I can have the most light possible let into the camera. So now that we have discussed aperture, your ISO is actually how sensitive the sensor of the camera is to light. ISO is very, very tricky, and you want to try and stay away from it as much as you can, because the higher your ISO goes, the more grainy the photo becomes and not really the quality you want to look for. So above all, you want to try and keep that ISO low. But however, if you notice, on days like this, where it's a little bit overcast, is actually perfect for sports photography, because one of the killers when you're taking pictures is bad shadows, which if you're shooting in direct sunlight, shadows are going to be a killer for you. So now that you have your exposure triangle set up, we're going to look at doing white balance. White balance might seem a little bit scary at first, but it's actually pretty simple. Your camera most likely has a lot of really good inbuilt modes for different settings. Often there's one called cloudy, sunlight, underwater, flash, all kinds of really great modes to just kind of play around with and find one that looks good for the setting you're shooting in. But also don't be afraid to go in there and mess with the manual color temperature using the Kelvin scale. It's not really that complicated. You go one way on the Kelvin scale, picture gets warmer. Go the other way, picture gets cooler. So after you have all of those settings set up perfectly, the next thing you need to make sure you have set, and this is probably one of the most important, is your focus mode. You want to make sure you're shooting in continuous autofocus, so that way your camera constantly tracks your subject and it keeps the subject in focus rather than locking focus once and simply leaving it there. So now that all your settings are good to go, let's take some pictures. Okay, so now that you have your photos taken, you're going to want to import them into Lightroom and do a quick, simple edit. I recommend personally using the auto function here in the top right-hand corner of the screen. You can simply click that auto and you see it does quite a bit here to fix this photo. Highlight's still a little bit too much for me, so we'll bring those down a bit. Push a little bit more contrast, and I think that photo looks pretty good. Go to the next one, go to this one here, do the same thing. This one we're gonna add a little bit of a crop to. Not that much of a crop. So we're gonna do it just about there. Try and center our subject and raise the exposure a bit, pull some highlights down, and there you go. There are your photos. Once you have them ready to go, simply select the photo you want, right click, export, export photo, select your folder for it. I like naming my folders like this with my raw files from the camera, and then what I'm going to be exporting from Lightroom. So right here, hit export, and you'll see your thing right here, 0 of 1. Once that's done, you're good to go. So guys, that's it for this video. I hope it helps you take a little bit better sports photos. And I want to give a big thank you to my friend Marcus helping me film this video. Marcus is one of the best videographers out there, amazing at weddings. Check out his work, link down in the description. See you guys next time. Go Durs.